Railroad Accounting Principal Board, Volume 1 of the GAU, Volume 1. Railroad Accounting Principal Board. This is the statements of the individual board members. It's the last chapter. I'll read this out. The statement of the chairman, Charles Borscher, and the members of the Charles W. Bath and J.K. L. Mahaffey and Merton J. Peck, Gordon Shinglaw, and Ronald S.J. The board initially proposed the exposure of the draft. The acquisition cost may be used as the value assets. In the initial final report, the board established the GAAP cost may use the value assets. The board reconsiderization of assets valuation approach after the considering commandments. The acquisition cost is not appropriate for the poolings. The board also considered comments favoring predecessor costs by requiring the GAAP to assess the acquired purchase of the reorganization reviewed of the current market value assets involved by the pool, retaining of the book value of the pooling entities. However, the board recognized the under certain of the circumstances, the GAAP cost may appropriate, therefore, provide the Interstate Commerce Commission to use the measure, including the predecessor cost determination, determined by a case-to-case basis. But we believe the final report adequately explains the board position of the asset valuation issuances during the board deliberations over the 2 years. The arguments of all interested parties regarding the assets valuation, including all the raised Mr. Briggs' separate statements, were presented to carefully considered by the board. Significantly issues discussed by the detail of the volume 2, chapter 7 of this report. If the other view of the language of the chapter explains the permissive and need for certain instances to use the predecessor cost value assets, the regulatory use of the assets valuation related expenses principles would not materially alter the Interstate Commerce Commission present practices of assessed valuation following the GAAP whenever possible. The application of the predecessor cost concept being an exception of the rule. Therefore, the deliberation of the board recognized that no single principle can be viewed in isolation or other principles from other collective uses of the various regulatory costing applications. For example, the board adopted the competitive market asset valuation of the GAAP cost consistent with the competitive market cost of the capital rates adopted by the board and use of the Interstate Commerce Commission. In our opinion, the board has established a set of interrelated accounting principles which lead to the consistent and practical applications determined by the railroad cost. Separate statements of Richard E. Briggs, a member of the Railroad Accounting Principal Board. The final report of the Railroad Accounting Principal Board represents a comprehensive review of the myriad of the complicated, frequently technical cost and accounting issues related to the federal system of economic regulation of railroad activities. Some of these issues have been debated for decades without total resolution. To obtain the broad basis for the deliberations, the board solicited comments by the railroad shippers and government agencies, economic accountants, and other interested parties on 3 separate occasions. They reviewed Walter I. Interstate of the Interstate Commerce Commission proceeding the conduct with special studies. The main of the principal recommendation of the observation presented in the final report should materially improve the cost accounting theories applied in the Interstate Commerce Commission. The ICC enhanced the economic accuracy. These advances should be abuse future decisions of the ICC with greater credibility for the integrity. While not every member of the board concurred with each of the principal recommendations, there was a general consensus of the numerous areas. The other members of the board are to be applauded for the diligence and perspective of the expertise they rendered. There are 2 plausible sides to some of the issues the board addressed, and the ultimate resolution of these issues can probably be left in the Interstate Commerce Commission. My main point of the departure for the final report concerns the decision not to prefer the matter of the principle of the use of the predecessor cost of the valuation assets to review the adequacy determinations. 2. 1. The truth of the report allows the ICC considerably leeway in the future to use the predecessor cost of the ICC use of the predecessor cost of the preferably the reason of the economic accuracy for the use of regulatory policy reasons. Nevertheless, it is extremely unwise for the board to adopt its assets valuation principle for the revenue adequacy even on its contingent basis. Footnote number 1, these comments should not be construed to be an endorsement of all the remaining portions of the final report. The board interpretations of the scope of the authority, the example for seem to be overlying the expense, particularly with respect of revenue adequacy. To my knowledge, the Commission practices the using of the predecessor cost for the value of assets of the revenue adequacy determination have never been made a major point of the contention until the railroad accounting principle board exposure draft. None of the original submissions of the board directed attention to this subject in any depth. None of the existing regulatory agencies used such practice. Board exposure draft elicited substantial evidence to the opposition of a board principle for the railroad. The Department of the Transportation economics of the sum of the interests. In truth, no other basic recommendation of the board drew other as much opposition, so little support. Under the circumstances, the board novel departure warranties very close scrutiny. Within strictures of the statement, it is not possible to present the substantial arguments on this question a great deal. These points are covered deep in the response. The exposure draft will be explored by the ICC informal proceedings in the briefing. However, the railroad principle board recommendations, whether it is accounting symmetry that represents unsounding regulatory economic policy, if applied by the ICC, the changes in normal regulatory practices and could lead to extremely undesirable results for the shippers and railroads alike. Potential acquirers of marginal railroads would face a more stringent limitation of their future earnings if the purchased assets effective would depress the assets sale the value further reduce their earnings potential. Moreover, a purchase of the marginal company will permanently excuse the company shippers from having to pay the assets written down as a result of all of the purchases. As a result, the fire sale price will be locked into a regulatory structure and any other where there will be opportunity for either there's new old owners to recapture the value of the prudent investment is there is today under the common regulatory practice. The inevitable result would be to diminution of all available railroad assets and services. Contrary to the GAAP notation of the comparability, the railroad which are not subject to the feature of the purchase will have the same type of the assets measured on a different basis, original cost. Nevertheless, the companies will be disadvantaged by the rates recently acquired rail competitors, which may be artificially constrained by the board's methodology. The board recommendation is moreover the double edge of the sword. Is purchased railroad is financially strong. Continued inflation will have been driven the contract values, and the asset will be of depreciated original cost, so they were over its long life investment. The acquisition price, while therefore be higher than the new owner would have been ability to raise rail rates to the higher levels than would be allowed in the current ICC practice. Shippers would have been paid once for the impact of the inflation. They may be called to pay twice for the same escalation in values. This is the same time the double count for the inflation. The board assiduously avoided into the pronouncement of abandonment and cost of the capital questions. Establishment of the value of the rail company on the basis of the investor judgment introduces the element of the regulatory circulatory, which has been disapproved previously by the Supreme Court. And see the FPC versus the Hope Natural Gas Company and 320 U.S. 591-601, 1944, Supreme Court. While the board recognized the existence of the problem and its deliberation is underestimated its potential on the issue. Indeed, the essential predicted of the board position on the question appears to be on the effect of the regulation of the railroad earnings and its material. But if there is a case of the board efforts would also be immaterial, there would have been no need for its long struggle to establish coherent regulatory accounting principles. In fact, the essential predicate is the missing of regulatory continuity continues to having very material effect on the railroad earnings. Regulatory policies governing such factors as a rate of entry, exits, interchanging the freight cars, mergers, loss, damage, contracting requirements, labor costs, trackage rights, adverse policies can have a huge impact on the railroad earnings. And either their reach of the regulatory controls affects even more than 10 to 20% of the railroad traffic, which is subject to the maximum rate of the regulation. If these policies of railroads earning significantly below the current cost of the capital, the value of the company will shrink. If a purchase then takes the place of the lower acquisition cost will be reduced, and carrier investment basement reduced is expensive because of the lower depreciation of the consideration, correspondingly increasing its income. The more constricting the regulatory policy, the more likely it is the carrier will be adjudged in revenue adequate, unless the bankruptcy overtakes it first. 2. The circulatory can be avoided by using either historic or replacement costs as board bid did in other areas. This is a threat, too. This is a threat hardly as an idle one. The acquisition costs were used several years ago. It would have made the Boston Main one of the nation's weakest railroads. The railroad is the highest rate, which has with the highest rate of return. The same artificial impairment would occur if the competitive rather than regulatory pressure resulted in the depressed earnings that were reflected in the lower acquisition prices. If the future competitive pressure lessened or the demand of the rail service improved, the board of principals were permanently capture maximum earnings below the levels necessary to provide a reasonable return of their individual origins, cost of the current values of the individual investments. Under either scenario, the vivacities of the acquisition pricing of the omnipresent, contrary to the board's casualty principle, value of the railroad properties have varied as much as 50% of the space of the only several years as a result of the shifting winds of the Wall Street without any of the significant long-term changes in the railroad industry or in the markets. These prices, whether high or low, would permanently ingrained it into the regulatory system. The board final report will allow the ICC to avoid their pitfalls in continuing using the predecessor costs. However, the potential problem outlined herein could have been avoided by the board, rejected in the endless entanglements inherent in this principle. And the last one is it says for additional U.S. General Accounting Office, P.O. Box 605. 6015, the Superintendent of Documents of the U.S. General Accounting Office, Gaithersburg, Maryland 20877-202-275-641. And that is Railroad Accounting Principles Final Report, Volume 1.